Spell sommelier for me, if you can." The word cut through the soft hum of the restaurant like a blade wrapped in silk, and for a moment, even the clinking of silverware seemed to hesitate under the weight of it. The lighting was warm, golden, the kind that made every glass sparkle and every table feel like a private stage. But Sophie Bennett stood there in her simple black uniform, feeling every pair of eyes slowly turning toward her as if she had just stepped into a spotlight she never asked for. Her fingers tightened slightly around the leather-bound notepad she carried, the edges worn, the corners softened by time, but her face remained still, composed, almost unreadable. Across the table, Margaret Cole leaned back in her chair with effortless elegance, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she folded her arms, a faint smile playing on her lips, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "It's a simple word," Margaret added, tilting her head just enough to make the challenge feel like an insult dressed as curiosity. A quiet ripple of amusement moved through the table, subtle but unmistakable. Sophie inhaled slowly, the scent of seared steak and expensive perfume filling her lungs, grounding her in the moment. She had been here before, not in this exact place, not with these exact people, but in this feeling, this quiet assumption that she didn't belong, that her presence was temporary, conditional, disposable. Her thumb brushed lightly against the edge of her notebook, where a single line of ink peeked out between the pages, a sentence she had written weeks ago and never quite finished. "Dignity is silent until it isn't." "I'm waiting," Margaret pressed, her voice soft but edged with something sharper, something colder. Sophie lifted her gaze, meeting Margaret's eyes fully for the first time, and for a split second, something shifted in the air, subtle, almost invisible, but real. Not defiance. Not yet. Just presence. At a nearby table, a man sat alone, his posture relaxed but his attention unmistakably fixed on the exchange unfolding just a few feet away. Alexander Cole had arrived 20 minutes earlier, unnoticed, unannounced, choosing a quiet corner. Instead of the center of the room, observing rather than commanding. He hadn't intended to stay long, but something about the way the waitress carried herself, steady, unhurried, untouched by the usual nervous energy, had kept him there. Now, as Margaret's words lingered in the air, he leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable, but his focus sharp. Sophie didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She simply stood there, her weight balanced, her breathing even, as if the silence itself belonged to her. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath with her. Margaret's smile widened just a fraction, mistaking the pause for hesitation, for weakness. "Or is that too difficult?" she added lightly, glancing around the table as if inviting agreement. A few polite chuckles followed. Sophie closed her notebook gently, the soft sound almost lost beneath the ambient noise, but it marked a shift, a line crossed. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear and steady, cutting cleanly through the room. "Es un millionaire," she said, each letter precise, effortless, leaving no space for doubt. The chuckles died instantly, but Sophie didn't stop there. She held Margaret's gaze, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were considering something far more interesting than the moment itself. And somewhere behind that calm, behind that quiet control, something else was rising, something that hadn't been heard yet, but was about to be. The silence that followed was not the polite kind that fades quickly, but the heavy kind that lingers, stretching just long enough to make everyone aware of it. And Sophie let it settle, let it breathe, her eyes never leaving Margaret's as if the rest of the room had simply disappeared from her awareness. Then, with a calm that felt almost unsettling, she tilted her head slightly and continued. "It is a French word, originally used to describe someone trained in the study and service of wine, though it is often mispronounced when people focus more on appearances than understanding." A few heads turned, subtle, curious, the earlier amusement replaced with something quieter, more attentive. Margaret's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to be noticed by those who were paying attention. Sophie did not raise her voice, did not shift her posture. She simply stood there, grounded, as if she had all the time in the world, as if the moment belonged to her now. "Would you like me to walk you through the wine list as well?" she asked gently, her tone polite, professional, but carrying an undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. At the table, someone cleared their throat, Another reached for their glass, suddenly unsure of where to look. Margaret straightened in her seat, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass, the diamonds on her wrist catching the light again. But this time, they did not seem as steady. "That will not be necessary," she replied, her voice still composed, but missing the effortless ease it held just moments ago. Sophie nodded once, as if accepting the answer without question, and opened her notebook again, her pen gliding smoothly across the page as she began to take the order, her handwriting neat, deliberate, each movement controlled. But as she wrote, her mind flickered briefly to the line she had left unfinished, the one that had followed her through long shifts and quiet nights. "Dignity is silent until it is not." She finished writing, closed the notebook again, and looked up, her expression neutral, almost soft. "I will have your order prepared right away," she said. And for a moment, it seemed like the moment might pass, like the tension might dissolve back into the warm glow of the restaurant. But something had already shifted, something irreversible. At the corner table, Alexander's gaze sharpened, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of his glass, untouched. He had seen confidence before, had built an empire around recognizing it, shaping it, controlling it, but this was different. This was not performance. This was not ambition dressed in politeness. This was something quieter, something earned. And it intrigued him. Across the room, Margaret watched Sophie turn away, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, not in confusion, but in calculation, as if reassessing, recalibrating the situation she believed she had already mastered. The laughter had not returned. The ease had not returned. And for the first time that evening, she was not the one controlling the room. Sophie took a step back from the table, her movements unhurried, and as she did, her notebook shifted slightly in her hand, the corner of a page catching the light just enough for a single line of ink to become visible before it disappeared again. "Dignity is silent until it is not." And somewhere behind her, in the quiet that followed, the balance of power had already begun to move. The moment should have ended there, quietly dissolving back into the rhythm of the restaurant. But it did not, because some moments refuse to be forgotten once they have been seen. And as Sophie moved toward the kitchen, she could feel it, the subtle shift in the air behind her, the way conversations resumed just a little slower, the way glances followed her not with dismissal, but with curiosity. She pushed through the swinging doors into the back, where the noise returned in full force, the sharp calls of chefs, the hiss of pans, the steady urgency that never paused. And yet even there, something inside her remained still. She placed the order slip down with careful precision, her handwriting clean and unmistakable, and for a brief second, she allowed herself a breath, a small exhale that carried more than just tension. Not fear. Not anymore. Out in the dining room, Margaret lifted her glass but did not drink, her gaze fixed in the direction Sophie had disappeared, her expression tightening not in anger, but in something more controlled, more deliberate. She was not used to being corrected, not publicly, not by someone she had already decided was insignificant. "Interesting staff they have here," she said lightly, though the words did not quite land the way she intended, the edge beneath them now more visible than before. Across from her, one of the guests shifted in their seat, offering a polite nod but no real agreement, and that absence of validation did not go unnoticed. At the corner table, Alexander finally reached for his glass, though his eyes never left the kitchen doors, his thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces that had not seemed important minutes ago. The confidence, the restraint, the choice of words. He had seen people pretend to be more than they were, had built his world around detecting that difference. And Sophie Bennett did not feel like someone pretending. She felt like someone choosing not to reveal. That difference mattered. Back inside, Sophie adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, smoothing it absent-mindedly, her fingers brushing again against the notebook tucked at her side. And this time she opened it, just slightly, just enough to glance at the line she had written earlier that week, the ink still sharp, the sentence still unfinished. "Dignity is silent until it is not." Her lips pressed together for a brief moment, not in hesitation, but in recognition, as if she understood now that the line was no longer incomplete. A voice called her name, pulling her back, and she turned immediately, stepping into the next task without pause, without hesitation, because this was still her job, still her reality, and she did not forget that. Minutes later, she returned to the dining room carrying a tray, her posture straight, her movements fluid. The earlier moment leaving no visible trace on her expression, and yet the room responded differently this time. Conversations softened as she approached Margaret's table, not out of fear, but out of attention. Margaret looked up as Sophie set the first plate down, her gaze steady, searching, as if trying to find something she had missed before. "You seem very well-practiced," Margaret said, her tone measured, carefully neutral now, though the question beneath it remained. Sophie met her eyes briefly, just long enough to acknowledge the shift, then continued placing the dishes with quiet precision. "Practice usually comes from experience," she replied simply, her voice even, offering nothing more, nothing less. At the corner table, Alexander's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, something recognizing the pattern unfolding, the layers revealing themselves not all at once, but exactly when they needed to. And as Sophie stepped back from the table once more, the balance that had begun to shift earlier did not return to its original place. It moved further, deeper, settling into something that could not easily be undone. Margaret did not look away this time when Sophie finished placing the last plate, and the silence that followed was no longer accidental. It was intentional, chosen, stretched carefully, as if she were deciding how to respond now that the dynamic had shifted beyond her control. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table, a small, controlled movement, but one that revealed more than her composed expression ever would. "Experience," she repeated softly, as if testing the word, weighing it against her own assumptions, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean in again, drawn by the quiet tension rebuilding between them. Sophie stood still, not retreating immediately this time, her posture relaxed but grounded, her attention steady, and that stillness alone created a contrast that Margaret could not ignore. "It is unusual," Margaret continued, her tone smoother now, less sharp but more deliberate, "to find someone with such articulation in this line of work." The words were carefully chosen, polished, but the implication beneath them remained unchanged, only disguised. A few guests shifted in their seats again, the earlier ease replaced by a subtle discomfort that no one openly acknowledged. Sophie lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if considering the statement rather than reacting to it, and when she looked back up, there was no defensiveness in her expression, only clarity. "People often underestimate what they do not take the time to understand," she replied, her voice calm, even, the kind that did not need volume to carry weight. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, not quite a smile, not quite irritation, but something in between, something recalculating. At the corner table, Alexander set his glass down slowly, the faint sound of crystal against wood barely audible, but his focus sharper than ever, his attention now fully claimed by the unfolding exchange. He had seen negotiations, power plays, strategic conversations worth millions, but this quiet battle of perception and truth held a different kind of precision, one that could not be taught, only lived. Margaret leaned forward slightly now, closing the distance just enough to reclaim some sense of control, her voice lowering as if to make the moment more intimate, though the room still listened. "And what is it that you believe I do not understand?" she asked, her gaze steady, her tone measured, but the challenge was clear. Sophie did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for the water glass at the edge of the table, adjusting it slightly to align with the rest, a small, almost insignificant gesture, but one that bought her time, one that kept her grounded in her role even as the moment stretched beyond it. When she finally spoke, her words were simple, but they landed with precision. "That intelligence does not always come dressed the way people expect," she said, her eyes meeting Margaret's again, not confrontational, not aggressive, just certain. The air shifted again, deeper this time, more final. A guest at the far end of the table let out a quiet breath they had not realized they were holding, while another lowered their gaze, as if suddenly aware of their own place in the moment. Margaret leaned back slowly, her expression smoothing over once more, the practiced composure returning, but it did not hold the same authority it had before. "Noted," she replied, her voice light again, though the effort behind it was now visible. Sophie inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response without pressing further, and stepped back from the table, her movements as composed as ever, but something within the room had changed in a way that could not be undone. As she turned, her notebook shifted again at her side, and this time, the corner of the page slipped free just enough for the line to be seen once more before disappearing into the fold. Dignity is silent until it is not. And as Sophie walked away, leaving the table behind, the quiet that followed was no longer filled with judgment, but with something far more powerful, respect, unexpected and undeniable, settling into the space where assumptions had once lived. The room did not return to normal after that. Not completely, because once a certain truth has been exposed, even quietly, it leaves a trace that lingers in the smallest details, in the way people look at each other, in the way silence begins to carry more meaning than words. Sophie moved through the restaurant with the same steady rhythm as before, delivering plates, refilling glasses, responding to requests with quiet efficiency, but the energy around her had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Guests who might have overlooked her before now watched her a second longer, not out of curiosity alone, but out of reconsideration, as if rewriting a narrative they had formed too quickly. At Margaret's table, the conversation attempted to recover, voices rising slightly, laughter returning in controlled bursts, but it felt practiced, thinner than before, as though everyone was aware of the moment that had already rewritten the tone of the evening. Margaret herself remained composed, her posture impeccable, her gestures precise, but her attention drifted more often now, her gaze occasionally following Sophie across the room, not with dismissal, but with calculation. At the corner table, Alexander finally signaled for service, his decision quiet but deliberate, and when Sophie approached, there was no hesitation in her steps, no trace of the earlier tension in her expression, only the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. "Good evening," she said, her voice even, professional, meeting his eyes briefly before lowering to the notepad in her hand. "What can I get for you tonight?" Alexander studied her for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested recognition, as if he were confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "I will have the chef's tasting menu," he replied, his tone measured, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something more attentive than a casual order required. Sophie nodded once, writing it down with the same neat precision, her pen gliding across the page without pause. "Any allergies or preferences I should note?" she asked. "No," he said, then added after a brief pause, "I trust your recommendation." It was a simple sentence, but it landed differently than most requests, because it was not framed as convenience, but as acknowledgement. Sophie's pen paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing, a subtle break in her otherwise seamless rhythm. "I will make sure it is prepared accordingly," she replied, her tone unchanged, though something in her eyes shifted, just slightly, as if she had recognized the intention behind his words. As she turned to leave, Alexander spoke again, his voice calm, but precise enough to stop her without raising it. "Miss Bennet," he said, using her name with quiet certainty. Sophie stopped, not abruptly, but with controlled stillness, turning back to face him fully now, her expression composed, but her attention sharpened. "Yes," she responded. Alexander held her gaze for a moment, not challenging, not probing, simply present. "You handled that situation with remarkable clarity," he said, his words direct, without embellishment, without performance. It was not flattery, it was observation. Sophie did not respond immediately. Compliments, especially from strangers, often carried expectations, assumptions, but this one did not feel like either. It felt neutral, honest. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet, but steady, accepting the acknowledgement without expanding on it, without inviting further interpretation. Alexander inclined his head slightly, as if that was all he needed, as if the exchange itself had already confirmed something he had been looking for. Sophie turned again, continuing her path toward the kitchen, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, but her thoughts no longer entirely on the tasks ahead. Behind her, Margaret had noticed the interaction, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal interest, her attention now divided between the waitress she had underestimated and the man who had just addressed her by name. And in that quiet intersection of observation and recognition, something new began to take shape, something that neither side had fully revealed yet, but both had already begun to sense. The kitchen doors swung shut behind Sophie, muffling the low hum of the dining room, but not the weight of what had just unfolded, because some moments follow you. Even when the noise changes, even when the setting shifts, and as she placed Alexander's order with the chef, her voice remained steady, her instructions precise, yet her mind moved somewhere deeper, replaying not the insult, not even the response, but the way her name had been spoken, deliberate, certain, as if it had not been guessed but known. She moved through the narrow space with practiced ease, stepping around staff, adjusting plates, maintaining rhythm, but her fingers brushed the edge of her notebook again, a small grounding habit she had developed over time, a reminder that there was always more beneath the surface than what people chose to see. Out in the dining room, Alexander remained still, his attention no longer hidden, his gaze occasionally lifting toward the kitchen doors, not impatient, not demanding, but observant, calculating in a way that came from years of reading people before they revealed themselves. Across the room, Margaret had not returned to her meal in any meaningful way, her fork resting untouched, her attention now divided between 2 points she could not quite connect, the waitress she had attempted to diminish and the man who had quietly disrupted her certainty without raising his voice. The space between those two variables unsettled her more than the earlier exchange, because it suggested a dynamic she had not accounted for. When Sophie emerged again, carrying the first course of the tasting menu, the room seemed to notice without meaning to. The subtle awareness returning as she approached Alexander's table, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, yet there was a quiet focus in her eyes now, as if she understood that this interaction would not be as simple as the others. She set the plate down carefully, describing the dish with clarity, her words measured, her tone professional, but when she finished, Alexander did not immediately respond, and instead, he studied her again, not as a customer assessing service, but as someone searching for confirmation. "You are not just working here," he said finally, his voice low, calm, but precise enough to hold her attention without demanding it. It was not a question. Sophie's hand stilled for a fraction of a second before she straightened, her gaze meeting his fully now, her expression unreadable, but not defensive. "I am working here," she replied, her tone even, her choice of words deliberate, offering truth without explanation. Alexander's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition of the answer itself, because it confirmed what he had already suspected, that she chose her words carefully, that she revealed only what she intended. "That is not what I meant," he said, still calm, still controlled, but more direct now. Sophie did not look away. The air between them shifted, quieter than the earlier confrontation, but no less significant. Around them, the restaurant continued, conversations rising and falling, plates being served, glasses refilled, but at that table, time seemed to slow, narrowing to a conversation that had not yet fully begun. Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering him, not as a customer, but as something else, something she had not decided how to define yet. "Then what did you mean?" she asked, her voice steady, not challenging, but inviting clarity. Alexander leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his posture relaxed, but his focus unwavering. "I mean that people who carry themselves the way you do are usually not where they appear to be," he said, each word measured, not probing for weakness, but for truth. Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, and this time, something softer passed through her expression, not vulnerability, but acknowledgement, as if she recognized the observation for what it was, not an attempt to expose her, but an attempt to understand. She exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, then gave the smallest nod. "Appearances are often more convenient than explanations," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a depth that hinted at something far beyond the walls of the restaurant. Alexander did not respond immediately, but something in his expression settled, as if a piece of a larger picture had just fallen into place. Across the room, Margaret watched the exchange unfold, her unease sharpening into something more focused now, because whatever was happening between them was no longer subtle, and for the first time that evening, She was not the one shaping the narrative. She was watching it shift without her consent. And as Sophie stepped back from the table once more, the quiet understanding between her and Alexander lingered in the air, unspoken, unfinished, but unmistakably real, marking the beginning of something neither of them had fully revealed yet, but both had already begun to recognize. Margaret's patience did not break loudly. It shifted quietly into something sharper, something more controlled, and as Sophie stepped away from Alexander's table, Margaret rose from her seat with measured elegance, her chair sliding back just enough to draw attention without causing a scene, and the subtle movement was enough to redirect the room once more, like a current changing direction beneath calm water. "Excuse me," she said to her table, though her gaze was already fixed ahead, following Sophie with intent rather than courtesy. Conversations softened again, not out of obligation this time, but anticipation, because something unfinished still lingered between them, something that had not reached its conclusion. Sophie heard the movement before she saw it, the shift in energy, the quiet ripple that traveled through the room, and when she turned, Margaret was already approaching, her heels measured, her posture flawless, her expression composed in a way that suggested control had not been lost, only recalibrated. "Miss Bennet," Margaret said, her voice smooth, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest, but not enough to be called a spectacle, and yet the effect was the same. Sophie stopped, turning fully to face her, her expression calm, her hands resting lightly at her sides, no longer holding the notepad, no longer shielded by the roll alone. "Yes," she replied, her tone even, neutral, offering nothing extra. Margaret studied her for a moment, longer than before, as if looking past the uniform, past the surface, searching for something she had missed earlier, something that no longer fit the narrative she had created. "You speak well," Margaret began, her voice measured, but the compliment did not land as one, "better than most people in your position." A pause followed, calculated, deliberate. "Which makes me wonder, why are you in it?" The question settled between them, heavier than it sounded, because it was no longer about spelling, or service, or etiquette. It was about identity, about place, about worth. Sophie did not respond immediately. Instead, she let the question exist for a moment, allowed it to carry its own weight, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, but there was something firmer beneath it now, something less willing to bend. "Because I chose to be," she said simply. Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief, because the answer did not align with expectation, did not offer explanation, did not justify itself. "People like you do not usually choose this," Margaret replied, her tone soft, but edged again, the earlier restraint thinning. Sophie held her gaze, unshaken. "People like me are usually defined by people who have never taken the time to know them," she said, her words quiet, but precise, each one landing without force, yet impossible to dismiss. At the corner table, Alexander's attention sharpened further, his posture still relaxed, but his focus absolute now, because this was no longer observation. This was revelation unfolding in real time. Margaret let out a small breath, her composure tightening, her control slipping not outwardly, but internally, because the conversation was no longer following her direction. "You seem very certain of yourself," she said, a faint smile returning, though it lacked warmth. Sophie did not smile back. "Certainty does not come from where you stand," she replied. "It comes from what you have already walked through." The words hung in the air, quieter than the earlier confrontation, but heavier, deeper, because they suggested a past, a history, something unseen but undeniable. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick adjustment, only silence, genuine and unguarded, and in that silence, the balance shifted again, not dramatically, but decisively. Around them, the room remained. Still, attentive without admitting it, watching without intruding, because something real had surfaced, something that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding or a mistake. Sophie inclined her head slightly, a gesture of closure, not submission, and stepped back, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, as if returning the moment to where it belonged. Margaret did not follow this time. She remained where she stood, her gaze lingering, her thoughts no longer certain, because the person she had tried to define had stepped outside of every assumption she had made. And at the corner table, Alexander watched it all with quiet clarity, because the final piece he had been waiting for had just revealed itself, not in a grand gesture, not in a dramatic confession, but in the calm, unwavering way Sophie Bennett refused to be reduced to anything less than who she truly was. Margaret did not immediately return to her table, and that hesitation alone spoke louder than anything she had said before, because it revealed something she rarely allowed others to see. Uncertainty, not loud or dramatic, but present, undeniable, and for a woman who had built her identity on control, that small crack was enough to change everything. The room felt it, even if no one acknowledged it directly. The way conversation slowed again, the way attention lingered just a second longer, because the narrative that had once been so clear had now unraveled in front of them. Sophie, however, did not wait for the moment to stretch further. She turned with quiet finality and resumed her work, stepping back into motion as if nothing extraordinary had happened, because to her, dignity was not something to perform, it was something to carry, consistently, regardless of who was watching. At the corner table, Alexander watched her move through the room again, but this time, his gaze carried decision, not curiosity, and after a brief pause, he stood. The movement was subtle, but it carried weight, the kind that shifted attention without demand, and as he adjusted his jacket, several heads turned, recognition beginning to ripple quietly through those who knew exactly who he was. Margaret noticed it too, her eyes shifting from Sophie to Alexander, her posture tightening almost imperceptibly, because now the pieces were beginning to align in a way she had not anticipated. Alexander stepped forward with measured ease, closing the distance between himself and Margaret, his expression calm, composed, but no longer distant. "Margaret," he said, his voice even, not raised, yet it carried through the space with quiet authority. She turned fully toward him, her composure snapping back into place with practiced precision, though something beneath it remained unsettled. "Alexander," she replied, her tone controlled, though the surprise could not be completely hidden. A brief silence followed, not awkward, but charged, because this was no longer a private interaction, it was a moment that would define everything that came after. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly toward Sophie, who had paused just enough to register what was happening before continuing her task, then returned to Margaret. "You seem to have had a very thorough interaction with the staff tonight," he said, his words carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, but layered with meaning that did not need to be explained. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, instinctively reclaiming her position. "I expect a certain standard," she replied smoothly, though the earlier certainty in her voice had softened. Alexander nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but not agreeing with it. "Standards are important," he said, his tone still calm, still controlled. "But so is recognizing value when it is right in front of you." The words landed differently than Sophie's had, not because they were louder, but because they carried a different kind of authority, one that came from someone who did not need to prove anything. Margaret held his gaze, searching for intent, for direction, but found neither clearly offered. "And what exactly are you implying?" she asked, her voice steady, though the question revealed more than she intended. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once more towards Sophie, who was now assisting another table, her movements unchanged, her focus unwavering, as if the entire moment unfolding behind her did not belong to her at all. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but more direct. "I am not implying anything," he said. "I am observing." The distinction hung in the air, subtle but powerful. Margaret's expression tightened, not visibly to most, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Around them, the room had grown quieter again, not out of obligation, but because something important was happening, something that extended beyond a simple misunderstanding. Sophie finished at the table she was attending and straightened, her notebook shifting slightly in her hand, the familiar line hidden just beneath the cover, unseen but present, just like the truth that had slowly revealed itself throughout the evening. And as Alexander and Margaret stood facing each other, the balance of power was no longer a question. It had already shifted, quietly, decisively, and there was no returning it to where it once had been. The silence that followed Alexander's last word did not feel empty. It felt complete, as if something that had been building all evening had finally reached its natural conclusion, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity, and Margaret understood that, even if she did not fully accept it. She held her posture for a moment longer, her composure still intact, but the certainty that once defined her presence had shifted into something quieter, something more measured, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried less edge than before. "Observation can be subjective," she said, choosing her words carefully now, aware of the audience, aware of the weight behind the man standing in front of her. Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without contesting it, because this was no longer about proving a point. It was about allowing the truth to exist without resistance. "Only when people refuse to look closely," he replied, his tone calm, final, leaving little room for further debate. Margaret's gaze flickered, just briefly, towards Sophie, who was now clearing a nearby table, her movements as steady as ever, her focus unchanged, as if the entire evening had not been about her at all. And that, more than anything, unsettled Margaret the most. There was no performance, no attempt to claim victory, no visible need for recognition, only quiet consistency, and that was something Margaret had not prepared for. Slowly, she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to be noticed, and without another word, she turned and returned to her table, the conversation there resuming in softer tones, more cautious now, more aware. Alexander remained where he stood for a moment longer, watching Sophie, not with curiosity anymore, but with respect, something earned, something rare, and then he moved back to his seat, the evening continuing, but no longer the same. When Sophie approached again to deliver the next course, there was no hesitation in her steps, no expectation in her expression, only the same calm professionalism she had carried from the beginning. She placed the plate in front of Alexander, describing it briefly, her voice even, her words precise, and when she finished, he looked at her, not as a customer, not as an observer, but as someone who had seen enough to understand. "You do not belong in the background," he said quietly, the statement simple, but grounded in certainty. Sophie met his gaze, her expression softening just slightly, not in agreement, not in denial, but in acknowledgement. "Sometimes the background is where you can see everything clearly," she replied, her tone steady, her meaning deeper than the words themselves. Alexander nodded once, accepting the answer for what it was, not pushing further, because he understood that some truths reveal themselves in time, not on demand. Sophie inclined her head gently, a subtle gesture of closure, and stepped away once more, her notebook shifting at her side, the familiar line resting within it, no longer unfinished, no longer waiting. "Dignity is silent until it is not." And as the night moved forward, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm, conversations rising again, laughter finding its place. But beneath it all, something had changed, not just in the room, but in the people who had witnessed it. Because they had seen what happens when assumptions meet truth, when status meets substance, and when someone refuses to be defined by anything less than who they truly are. And long after the tables were cleared and the lights dimmed, that quiet moment, that calm response, and that unshakable presence would remain, not as a spectacle, but as something far more lasting, a reminder that real value does not demand attention. It reveals itself when it matters most.